Oh, wait a minute. I need to do one thing first. I need a hot mic hunter who looks like they're paying attention out there. How about Jeannie? Can you do that? I see you've got, looks like you're on a laptop up there. Can you be co-host?
Well, I'm actually, yeah, I guess I can. I can.
Or did you need to go to bed early tonight?
I was planning on snoozing while you were talking. I'm totally teasing. No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Let me share the screen again. The Torah portion this week is Vayeshev, and you probably know by now, if you've been through a few Torah cycles, it means and dwelled, or and lived, or settled down, and it has the same root as the regular verb to sit, to sit in a chair. So when you sit in a chair, it signals that you're settling in for a while. And the readings are Genesis 37:1 through 40:23, Amos 2:6 through 3:8, Psalm 112, and Matthew 18:1 through verse 18. And even though we don't have time to in this session, I really do encourage you to go back and look at Psalm 112 and see how close the themes follow this particular Torah portion and the themes that we want to kind of tease out in this session. And the theme I wanted to tease out has to do with honor. We've covered all sorts of things in this Torah portion in years past. We've come at it from all different approaches. And we've even discussed Tamar before, because the story of Tamar is foundational to Workbook 4, The Scarlet Harlot and the Crimson Thread. And we're going to do that again tonight. We're going to take a look at that, but maybe from a different angle. And it has to do with her honor. That was a point that came out in our study yesterday. How much honor that Tamar was able to give Judah in spite of his dishonorable actions. And she's become iconic of a person who knows how to give honor to a dishonorable person. We tend to think that honor has to be deserved or it has to be earned. In some ways, it does. But in a basic human sense, all human beings deserve some element of honor. And we're going to discuss why, using Tamar here as our pattern and focusing on her eyes. What did Tamar see? Where did she dwell? The Torah portion is about where Jacob dwelled. But in the same Torah portion, we're told where Tamar dwelled or where she sat. It's the same thread. So we're going to pick it up through her eyes. And then your homework, if you choose to accept it, will be based on a passage where Yeshua speaks of, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. And passages like that can be misunderstood if they're taken not just out of context, but taken out of the Jewish context of the first century. So we can use this Torah portion to unpack where Yeshua might have been going with that particular teaching. Of course, you've got your Torah memory book. And for the Torah portion, Vayeshev, I just tried to keep it simple. So if you're adding to your memory book for Vayeshev, what I wrote was, when Jacob settled, Vayeshev, in Canaan, his sons became bitter against Joseph and sold him into slavery. And what we're going to read about Tamar really fits into that, because it helps to explain that particular tension, I believe. And so Genesis 37:1, it kicks us off. It says, now Jacob lived, he dwelled in the land where his fathers had sojourned in the land of Canaan. And by the way, the root of Canaan has to do with being a merchant. And so it has a close relationship, as we look in the book of Revelation, to Babylon, which is all about merchandise, trafficking. So with a Canaanite, there is, in each of these little subgroups of Canaanites, there's some way that they're trafficking things. And that makes a great study. And I think that's also in the Torah portion workbooks. I'm not really sure which particular edition of them, but I know we did a word study on the different subgroups of Canaanites, on, the ites. But our question tonight is a question that's asked by not just one, but many Torah scholars. And the question is about the opening verse of the Torah portion. And they ask, why does the Torah feel it necessary to tell us where Yaakov dwelled? Aren't we already told? Yaakov came to Yitzchak, his father, to Mamre, Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Yitzchak sojourned. And Genesis 35:27. Very specifically, we're told where he dwelled. And so they're asking, why are we being told again? And they say, furthermore, why does the verse have to tell us that the land where his father sojourned is the land of Canaan? Don't we already know that? Well, when we have good questions, they usually lead to very insightful answers. And so let's see if we can work on the problem. And one approach that they took was by examining Esau's two merits. We've looked in years past at how up and down Esau's life was. He'd do a good thing, he'd do a bad thing. He'd do a good thing, he'd do a bad thing. He was very inconsistent, but he did have some shining moments. We know that he loved his father very much. We know that he liked to please his father. We know that he liked to spend time with his father. And in all the 20 plus years that Jacob was in Haran, building his family, Esau never left his parents. He stayed right there with his parents and cared for them, because remember, at this point, Isaac is blind and he needs the help. They have a huge camp. They inherited Abraham's souls. So he's got his own community that he has to manage, in addition to the flocks and the herds and the camels and so forth. So he even has to run a little government to keep things sorted out. And so Esau's, one of his two merits that they point out is that Esau, if we set aside the Canaanite wives, which he later tried to rectify, not the right way, but in the Esau way, instead of divorcing the Canaanite wives, he just goes and gets an Ishmaelite wife. He goes and gets a relative, thinking that that's going to fix the damage that he's done. But even that action, even though it's a little misguided, you can see that he does care what his parents think. He usually cares too late, but he does care. And so he does have some sort of inner sense that he needs to honor his father and mother. He stays with them, he cares for them. And even in his decision that he wanted to kill Jacob, nevertheless, he restrained himself and he honored his father and mother by saying, you know what, I won't bring them to grief by doing it while they're still alive. And so he's kind of made a decision to do a dishonorable thing in an honorable way. So he does have some merit, and most rascals do. Most rascals aren't 100% rascals. If you dig down a little bit, they might have, I don't know if we would call them redeeming qualities, because those qualities can't really redeem you. Yeshua redeems us. But in terms of character traits, we can see that there is some honor there to be salvaged if possible. Yeshua thought it was worth it to salvage the honor in dishonorable people. And so now that Jacob's returned after 20 plus years, he needs to perform these same mitzvot for his father. As the Midrash says, Jacob receives word that his mother has died as he's on his way back, because there's this strange little insertion into the text about how Rebecca's nurse died, and it's thought that she had brought this news that he needed to get home to see his mother. The nurse dies, and of course his mother dies. There's different variations on that. You might find a different version of it, but it appears that his mother did die before he reached home, which was our question last week. Why was Jacob circling the airport when it was time to land and to go to his father's house in safety? So now he has some time to make up for. He has the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvot, which Esau had been fulfilling, honoring his father and mother as they age, taking care of them. So Jacob has some catching up to do. And if we compare them, we can't say this is a clear cause and effect scenario. But if we look at Esau and his descendants, they do remain in the land of Israel longer than Jacob. And they remain particularly longer on the territory that they are given in what's called Edom or Seir. They don't leave it. And this follows a principle. It kind of reminds us of what Esau was doing for the 20 years that Jacob was gone. Exodus 20:12, it says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. And in Esau's case, his days were prolonged both in the land and in the land that he was given, which was Edom. When Jacob returns and he sees how much livestock is there and it can't be supported, he picks up and he moves down to Seir or Edom, and he prolongs his days. We even get the genealogy as we continue reading of the princes that descended from him. And then in Deuteronomy 5:16, it says, honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be prolonged and that it may go well with you on the land which the Lord your God gives you. So even though Esau has lost the birthright and the blessing, we can see that these two promises are fulfilled in his life. His days were prolonged in the land which the Lord his God gave him. It went well with him. He told Jacob, he says, I have enough. You don't need to give me gifts. I have plenty. So I have been blessed. My days have been prolonged. And the sages say this is primarily because he simply honored his parents. He wasn't perfect, but he made an effort to stay with them. So let's look at the honor, because this is where we're going with Tamar, her ability to honor a dishonorable person. Honor your father and mother is stated twice. We know it's important. And we know they call it the first commandment with a promise, that if you do this, then there is a promise. Honor in Hebrew is kavod or kaved. It depends on how you're using it. In modern Hebrew, if somebody does an awesome job or a great job, you say kol hakavod, all the honor. You've earned it. Glorious, your ability here. So kaved is the imperative form of the verb when we're looking at the 10 words. And I went ahead and put the commandment up there, at least a fragment of it, so that you could see what it looked like in Hebrew. Kaved et avicha ve'et imecha. Honor your father and mother. So honor or glory, kaved, it would have the same root as COVID, a word we're all familiar with right now. And so when we read the word kaved, it serves up contra-nym opportunity. It can represent honor and glory, like we see it in the 10 words, where we're supposed to honor our father and mother. Its opposite is that it can mean anger and the liver. And we looked at this back when we looked back at Pharaoh's livered heart, when we looked at the onset of COVID-19 and the implications of the name of the virus. And when it broke out in a significant month on a significant day that we're not commanded, but the pattern in scripture is that we fast on that particular day, on the 10th of Tevet. And so as we look at kaved as a contra-nym, we can see that if you disrupt the divine laws of honor that apply to every human being, then you expose yourself to anger and to judgments. Just like last week when we were talking about if you break your vow, if you're slow to fulfill your vow, you can open yourself up to judgments. Same thing with honor. If you disrupt that divine plan for human beings, then you open yourself up to anger and judgment. And I cannot give you the exact site. It's one of those things I've read and I didn't mark it down anywhere. And if you look behind me, you can see how many volumes of the Mishnah there are. You could probably do a word search on it in Sefaria and find it. But it says in the last generation, it says that parents will bow to their children, which should ring a bell if you've read the Torah portion. In Joseph's dream, Jacob interpreted it as Joseph thought that his father and mother would bow to him. And this is what the Mishnah says: in the last generation, it will be parents bowing to their children, and it's not seen as a good thing. It's seen as a complete disruption to the fabric of the universe, which is built on these 10 words that we must honor our father and mother. If we have fathers and mothers who feel obligated to bow to their children as though they are the heads of the household, and we see that a lot. I mean, we even see it reflected in commercials where you see children, whatever the ad is for what they're selling, somehow the ad portrays the children as being the smart ones and the parents as being the dumb ones, or the dull ones, or the slow to get it ones, the dimwits. And it's the children who must be respected, and their information and their knowledge of technology must be bowed to. And so I don't know if this is the last generation, but we do see that pattern commonly now. And Yeshua pointed out a perverse practice of the first century that was going on. In order to avoid supporting aging parents or disabled parents, a man could dedicate a particular object or money to the temple, but it didn't have to be paid until he died. And so he had possession of the object or money until his death, at which point it would be paid to the temple. And what this did is it protected his ability to manage his money and the profits from it while he was alive. But because he had already consecrated the money or the object, it could not be given or sold to aid his aging parents. And there's a problem here on two levels. There's a problem with the person who thinks this is okay, and there's a problem with a court system that not only permits it, but encourages it. And so it was a generation that was dishonoring their parents and destroying the Torah. When we say destroy the Torah, that means an improper interpretation or application of the Torah. In ancient times, they'd say, you're destroying the Torah, you're destroying the Torah. What do they mean? You're improperly applying it. You're improperly interpreting it. And so this manipulation of something which could be good, dedicating objects to the temple, just became a workaround so that people wouldn't have to support their parents as they grew older and disabled, which happened very fast in that day and time. And we know that that did not go unnoticed because it's the first commandment with a promise, but to ignore it apparently also goes with judgment and punishment, because that the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So from the time 33 AD, when Yeshua pointed out this dishonorable practice, it wasn't much longer, not even a complete generation, until the temple was destroyed. Is that cause and effect? We can't say for sure, but they do seem to go together. So let's just review a little bit about the liver. When we're talking about kaved as honor, we know it's also the liver. And we had this example back when we first started doing that Shabbat live stream on Saturdays. In Exodus 10:1, it says, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them. And in the Hebrew text, we see that what is translated as his heart is not really, there's more to it. There's more levels, because what has happened to Pharaoh, he has hardened the heart of his servants, but the description of what he's done to the heart is hikvadati. Hikvadati. In other words, he's saying, I've livered Pharaoh's heart. I've made it heavy, because the liver is seen as being the heaviest of the organs. And what's happening here, it's basically that Adonai has made Pharaoh's heart like a liver, kaved, heavy. And here's some explanations. If we want to look at kavad as the root there, kavod is the one we would be more familiar with. This is Strong's 3513, and it does relate to weight, like the glory falling and you feeling a weight like you can't stand up, but in a good sense. It can mean splendor, glorious, glory. And what we're really looking at here for this Torah portion is honor. It denotes honor. It can also mean abundance, riches, dignity very much goes with honor. Reputation goes with honor. Reverence goes with honor. And this is what we see is Pharaoh's heart has the wrong kind of honor. He's filled with his own glory and honor. And when your heart is filled with your own glory and honor, when it has been made kaved, heavy, then you don't have room for anyone else. That you try to destroy the competition. And that's the pattern. Now, kaved can also literally mean the liver. Kaved can also mean heavy, stupid, difficult, hardened, heavy, slow, thick. So again, the wrong kind of honor, which is self-honor, can make you stupid. And we see that in Pharaoh. He had so hardened his own heart that he had made himself stupid. And he wasn't seeing the writing on the wall. And so in Psalm 16:8 through 10, we see an example of how the heart and glory, or the liver, kaved, tend to go together in context. It says, I have set the Lord continually before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart, my lev, is glad, and my glory, kvodi, rejoices. So your heart and your liver, they have a relationship. And so sometimes the liver, the kaved, can be substituted for lev, which is heart. They're words in the hood, as we would call them. They tend to show up in the same neighborhood. It says, my flesh also will dwell securely, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. And so the heart and the glory in this context is attached to a hope that our souls will not be abandoned to Sheol. Tamar is going to have this very hope as her interaction with Judah progresses, even up to the point where they take her out to be burned. It's as though you can hear her saying this, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, because of what she's done to preserve Judah's honor. Also, as a review, we know, and I just did a screenshot from World Health Organization, where it tells us the Chinese authorities identified a new type of coronavirus, which was isolated on 7 January 2020. 7 January 2020 was the 10th of Tevet. And so the 10th of Tevet is when the word COVID would have pretty much exploded on to the scene. We know there's, COVID is not specific, so it's been out there. But COVID-19 has brought COVID and therefore kaved into the consciousness of the world. It's also when the siege of Babylon on Jerusalem began. It began on the 10th of Tevet. And it lasted either 18 or 30 months, depending on how you calculate it out. And we've done that. We've projected that out, and we see that if we were to do that from the 10th of Tevet, when COVID-19 was isolated on the 10th of Tevet, then it does fall on significant dates. And in the year 2020, in the Gregorian year 2020, we will have 2 10th of Tevets. We will have 2 siege dates in the same Gregorian year, because the next one, believe it or not, falls on December 25th of 2020. So if you didn't fast on the 10th of Tevet last year, or this year, then you have an opportunity again this year to fast on the 10th of Tevet, to commemorate and to intercede against the siege of Jerusalem, of which we are a part. And so when we look at the eye, and there's a point to talking about the eye, that's going to be an important thing. In Hebrew context, when you talk about a bad eye, it means an attitude of stinginess. If we think of Yeshua's example of children not taking care of their parents so that they can keep the money, well, that's a bad eye. And it's not just stinginess with money, but it's being stingy with the honor and the respect due to parents. And if you're stingy with that, then therefore you're being stingy with the Holy One who set the commandment in place. So if you're a person who can't honor Adonai and his parents, then you're probably a person who cannot honor other people who don't reciprocate to your animal soul. Your animal soul likes the bad kind of honor. There's 2 kinds of honor. And we tend to be able to see that pretty easily. Somebody who senses that you can't do anything for them, or you won't do anything for them, then their attitude towards you will become disrespectful and dishonorable. Now, if they thought for a moment you could do something for them, then they would pretend to treat you with honor. So in the Hebrew calendar, there's certain organs, senses, and even Hebrew letters that are associated with the months. If you follow Keisha's blog, then you probably already know this. But There are even particular constellations that represent the tribes and their divine attributes. It's been twisted into astrology, but nevertheless, there is a witness into the stars of these things. And so the 10th month, Tevet, is associated with the tribe of Dan, which means he judged. So it's a month of judgment. And we see that. We got COVID-19 in the month of Tevet. We were judged. It's also associated with the attribute or the characteristic of anger. The organ it's associated with is the liver, which is tied to anger. And then also with the organ of the eye. Not because it's the organ, but because it's the Hebrew letter associated with that particular month, the eye. And these things really do tie together in the story of Tamar. It's how we see things that determines whether we can honor what is commanded to be honored. And so as we're reading the story of Joseph, it might seem like it's an interruption, but it's not an interruption. It's an insertion into the story of Joseph. So we've got the story of Judah and Tamar to help explain to us the story of Joseph. So if we go back, we can see at the beginning, Joseph tells Jacob a dream and forces his brothers to listen to this dream, where the sheaves and then the sun, the moon, and the stars bow down to him. And according to what Jacob believes in interpretation, he believes that Joseph intends to make his parents and his brothers bow down to him. That would be contrary to the commandment to expect parents to honor children in the way that children are commanded to honor parents. And then the Midrash goes on and it tries to explain Joseph's evil reports to Jacob concerning his brothers. And in each case, which this is Midrash, we don't know if it's true or not, but what he thought he saw and what was actually happening were two different things. And so he was tattling according to his perception without having all the facts at hand. And they were not actually doing what he said they were doing. But whether that's true or not, what is happening by bringing the evil reports, he's bringing dishonor to his brothers who are older than he. He's bringing dishonor to his father's name. He's diminishing their kavod, their glory, the respect that's due them as elders to him. And so if it was Jacob encouraging it, we might need to throw in, a what if. What if your parent encourages you to do something that's disrespectful? What if your parent encourages you to break a commandment? The sages say the most honorable thing you can do for such a parent is not to do what they're asking you to do. Instead of doing what they're asking you to do, the most respectful thing you can do is to obey the commandment. They'll appreciate it later. They might not be happy now, but they'll appreciate it later. So you might have to honor a parent with obedience to the commandment, disobeying an improper request, but always with the utmost respect. And so Rabbi Kook gives us illustrations of the two kinds of honor. The first kind is the kind we don't want. He says, illusory honor is based on external acquisitions, wealth, position, fame, and so on. In fact, if you lost those things, people would treat you differently because they weren't based really on your intrinsic honor. It was based on external things. He says pursuing this type of honor is a negative trait. It causes one to lose his way and squander his time on inconsequential matters instead of kingdom business. And so when Judah sends the kid to Tamar in payment for services rendered, she's not there. What Tamar wanted from Judah was not material wealth. What she wanted was to obey the commandments. She wanted to bear righteous children. Is she a prophetess? Does she know that there is a line of kings, a dynasty of kings to descend from Judah? Maybe, maybe not. But she's surrounded by prophets. She's got Isaac there. She's got Jacob there. That's pretty lofty company. In fact, tradition has it that her father, or at least her descendant, was Shem, the priest of Shalem, and that she was nobility herself because she was either the daughter or the descendant of a priest. So what do we see in Judah? He's been squandering time with a Canaanite wife who was able to influence their children to evil. And then not just Judah, but his sons squander Tamar's time. She's a righteous woman. Remember, I don't know if I've ever said it to this class, but if I haven't, I'll go ahead and say it. So many times what we steal from people is their time. And it's very easy to do that without realizing that you're doing it. But for a righteous person, they know that their days are numbered. And they know that they only have so much time to fulfill the things for the kingdom that they are able to do. And when you waste their time with inconsequential matters, then are you really stealing from the person? Kind of. But most of all, you're stealing from the Holy One who has given them tasks to do. And so we see that Judah and his sons in this situation had become time and honor thieves, because the text tells us that it's after a long time that Tamar finally realizes, because Shilah's grown up, Judah's not turning loose of him. And so what Tamar is going to do is teach Judah an object lesson in seeking the kingdom with a wife that will please his righteous parents and bring righteous children to work and guard the kingdom of the Holy One with reverence. She's not consumed with inconsequential matters, things, and people. So the second type of honor is the honor that Tamar is concerned with. And so she's used as the example of this type of honor. And this is an inner quality of awareness of a human being's true inner worth, that each human being is a creation formed in the image of Elohim. And Rav Kook makes the assertion that this awareness is the very foundation of morality, even in the secular world. Only with this kind of honor can we live a life rooted in ethical and spiritual principles. Only then will we value the nobility of human life. If we don't recognize the nobility of human life, then we will think nothing of sacrificing them. We will think nothing of stealing their time. We will think nothing of stealing their honor. And he writes, it's preferable to forfeit life in this world rather than publicly shame another person, permanently disgracing him and ruining his honor. He's obviously never read an American newspaper or read an online article in an American newspaper. He says such a public defaming will bring about the loss of all value in living, a slow and degrading demise. And we've seen that. Shaming others is not unique to this generation. It just seems to have become a worldwide flood in this generation. And this can only bring about a slow and degrading demise. Once you destroy someone's honor, once you ruin him or her, it's not easily repaired. And if we go back to what we learned about the liver and COVID-19 and the 10th of Tevet and the 18-month siege of Jerusalem, what we saw in Ezekiel's pattern was that it was a slow boil. Jerusalem didn't fall overnight. It fell because of this slow heating of the siege, this slow demise that he's talking about when we dishonor other people. And so we've seen an exponential rise in what we know are triggers for such a siege. Especially with the second temple, Yeshua just calls it out. It's dishonoring people. And so we shouldn't be surprised that a plague officially entered our world on the 10th of Tevet, and it's still slowly turning up the heat on what human beings are willing to say and do to one another. And when you think we can't go any farther than we've already done, then we can turn on the news and see that, yes, we can actually fall to a lower level of defaming one another. And so we see that this inner eye that Rabbi Kook was talking about, it's failing across the world. Despite multiple ways, my Hebrew tutor told me that Israel just experienced its third wave of COVID-19. So we're seeing multiple waves of lockdowns that should have given us time to focus that inner eye. And instead, what we see more and more out in the world is that this inner eye of nobility just keeps becoming dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. And especially politicians and activists who should be, doing positive things in the world, there is no low that they won't stoop to and how they speak of one another. We see self-righteous anger and judgment increasing. These are signs of the liver. These are signs of dishonor because it does bring anger. Remember, the liver and anger, they go together, just like Pharaoh's livered heart. But Tamar's example gives us hope. In Genesis 38:12, it says, now after a considerable time, remember when we have time thieves? After a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timna, and he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timna to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garment and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timna. For she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. And, it said that she was so modest anyway that he rarely saw her face. So she wasn't as familiar to him as we would think she was. And so this is the area we know from the clues of where Judah went up to shear his sheep. This is the general area where he would have gone. And this is a picture of the road to Shiloh. But as you get up north of Jerusalem into this area, which later in the book of Joshua, it tells us that Enaim was close to a place called Tapuach. And we know where Tapuach was. We know that Shiloh, Shechem, Tapuach, Enaim, they are in this area north of Jerusalem. The strange thing about it is that it calls it the road to Timna. There is no Timna here. So in the literal physical world, the area where Tamar would have waited for Judah to pass by would have looked something like this. But where is Timna? Well, it's a long way away. But that area in the photograph there, that's probably the general vicinity. It's also later the vicinity where Joseph is going to be kidnapped and sold from the area around Shechem. And so the idea that a place called Timna is just inserted into a location where there's really no history of it. There's some guesses as to where it may have been, but the location is given twice. It says Timna. And so because it's pretty much absent from any history of that location, it forces us to where we know a Timna is for maybe a spiritual application. Maybe we know where she was literally probably located, but what's the spiritual message that we're forced to see because of the insertion of Timna? Because Timna's in the extreme south of Israel. It intersects the territory of Edom. And it was a place, and you can still go see those today, of copper mines. And they needed those copper mines because, remember, we're talking about the Bronze Age. And so they need the copper to create the bronze tools and weapons. And in scripture, bronze denotes fire. The brazen altar, sometimes it's called the copper altar, that's where the sacrifices were burned in the wilderness. And so Tamar has kind of become a figurative sacrifice, and she's even threatened with burning. So if we look to where Timna is, that we know it is, it's not a place where Judah would have taken his sheep to shear them. This is what it looks like. There's not going to be any sheep there. If it is, it's going to be a very small Bedouin flock. It's just not hospitable to sheep shearing. So again, it's having things that don't really go together that make us ask the question. Maybe there's a spiritual application I'm supposed to be seeing, not just a literal location where she's sitting. What can Timna teach me that maybe the area of Shechem could not? So we'll look at Timna. It comes from mana, and it means to deny, to keep back, to refrain, to restrain, or to withhold. This is exactly what Judah has done, and this is exactly what and Onan have done to Tamar, a righteous woman. They have withheld from her righteous children and a righteous marriage. The first mention of manna is in Genesis 32. It says, then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, there's our anger, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So Jacob gives us some words in the hood here. Withheld, the root of Timna, and he becomes angry with Rachel. And it has to do, again, with withholding the fruit of the womb, which is what has been withheld from Tamar. And so it's possible that by inserting a place name that really doesn't belong, that it's emphasizing that message that Tamar is doing this because Judah and his sons have withheld children from her. And she was thought, again, to be a noble woman, a descendant of Shem. Her name Tamar means palm tree, which is a symbol of righteousness in scripture, of uprightness. Is there a Tamar on the way to Timna? Well, the answer is yes. If we go again to the extreme south, there may be things in the little area of Timna that can help us decode the spiritual message. And it fits the description, which suggests that she sat at a crossroad. Biblical Tamar is on the ancient spice route. To the east is Petra and Moab. To the north, you go to Judea. The road west will take you to Beersheba or Egypt. And if you go south, the road will take you to the Timna copper mines. And these are pictures of a very ancient jujube tree there at Tamar and the well at Tamar. And it's mentioned in Ezekiel 47:19 and Ezekiel 48:28. It marks borders in the south. Tamar is, in fact, that region today is called Tamar Regional Council. That area is known as Tamar. And here's a map to help you kind of get a visual as to where the area called Tamar is, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the pin there. It's below the Dead Sea. And then Timna, if you keep going south on that road that goes by Tamar, it takes you down to the Timna mines, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner where the pin is. So it's a bit of a hike, but it goes due south. So you would pass through Tamar, which is a place of crossroad. That's why that ancient fortress has been rebuilt so many times, because it's a perfect crossroad location. So this may not have been the literal crossroad, but people may have known of it and maybe known the symbolism of Timna and Mana as something withheld. So we know both and Onan were called evil in the eyes of Hashem. But where Tamar sat in wait, and the idea there is, look at the eyes. It's the eyes that keep coming up. And they're going to come up in a strange way again. When it tells us where Tamar sat, where she dwelled, just like the name of the Torah portion. She sat in wait for Judah, but typically your Christian Bible translations into English, and then those done by Jewish scholars, will differ as to where she sat is understood. Now, I just picked NASB because I use that a lot. So it says she removed her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, wrapped herself, sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timna. In the Art Scroll, it says she removed her widow's garb from upon her, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and she sat at a crossroads, which is on the road toward Timna. She sat at a crossroads. That's critical. Look here at the Hebrew. It says, Vayeshev bepechat enaim. So she sat, or she dwelled, at the opening, at the entrance of eyes. And this is how we can see that Vayeshev's subplots are all describing to us how the children of Jacob are dwelling in the land. And then in Joseph's case, how is he faring in exile as he dwells in exile? But in this little subplot, we can see Vayeshev is describing Tamar's dwelling. How is she doing? Well, we're told she's dwelling here as she waits on Judah at the opening of eyes on the way to Timna. She's sitting at the opening of the eyes. And it says that she saw, you could see that in the Hebrew text, ra'ata. She saw Judah intended to withhold Shelah and children from her. So it's what's happening here at the opening of the eyes at Tamar's dwelling that's going to open Judah's eyes. And a crossroads, Rashi says, is called an opening of the eyes because it's the point at which the traveler must open his eyes to decide which way to go. And this is what is going to happen to Judah. When Tamar is found to be pregnant, Judah judges her. He sentences her to death by burning. Now, if she is a daughter or descendant of Shem, i.e. Melchizedek, that makes sense because he was a priest, and burning is the penalty for the daughter of a priest who is caught in immorality. But rather than shame Judah's honor, who was going to be the progenitor of the king dynasty, the monarchs of Israel, Tamar waits literally until the last moment to produce the three emblems that are accepted even within Judaism to be the emblems of Mashiach: the staff, the signet ring, and the garment. And so the staff is both a shepherd's staff, but it's also an object of tribal authority, a sign of Mashiach, where it says in Isaiah 11:1, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse. The garment where he wrapped himself, it's like a husband covering his his betrothed, as he marries her in a talit for the wedding ceremony. His signet ring is what seals legal agreements. So what Tamar did back when he didn't even know who she was, is she procured 3 things that signified his agreement to a marriage. And he even calls her a play on word, Hakadesha, the holy, which can also mean a temple prostitute, but that play on word there. And so when she vanishes, Judah doesn't seek the prostitute. He doesn't want the shame of the matter to become known. He doesn't want to diminish his own honor. And so Tamar also doesn't want to diminish his honor. And she gives Judah a chance to have her killed so that his transgression won't be found out. What she does allows him to seek the wrong kind of honor among his peers and family, who they think he is rather than who he is. And so it says, as she was taken out, as she's taken out to be burned, she takes these 3 items and she says, do you recognize these? And there's Judah's choice. Which honor will he choose? And if you'll remember, that's the same question Judah had asked of his father Jacob when he deceived him by bringing Joseph's garment torn, bloody. They had used the blood of a kid. So Tamar knows that she has asked particularly for a kid. That's what he's promised her. This is what's coming. Then they can't deliver the kid. They can't deliver the little goat. And so that particular thing, because we know he's on his way to sheep shearing, it doesn't say anything about goat shearing. He's on his way to sheep shearing. So he makes an effort to say, I'll send you a kid from the flocks. And then she asks him the same question. Do you recognize this? And so when she produces these 3 personal emblems, Judah gets the deeper question. Do you see? Do you see your deception? Do you see your dishonor to your father? Because the decision you make at this crossroad, the decision you make in this matter on the road to Timna is going to lead to a decision in another matter on the road to Egypt. And that's the way our spiritual life goes. The decision we make at today's crossroad, which might make us feel humiliated and ashamed, may lead us to a great decision on a different road, where we needed that experience of choosing shame and humiliation rather than inconsequential honor and fame, the wrong kind of fame. We begin to practice that. So down the road, on the road to Egypt, we can step up like Judah did and say, I will guarantee Benjamin's safety. We will say, I will go and be your servant in place of Benjamin. I will sacrifice my life to save the honor and the life of another. And so we're left with that dilemma sometimes. We can conceal a temporary shame in exchange for the wrong kind of honor, or we can choose to be shamed now in order to obtain that greater honor of human nobility, when we will have that feeling that we've all had when we've done such a thing, and we knew that our behavior was conformed to the image of Elohim, that was a truly human decision that we made because of the way that he created us. And so there's a rabbit trail we don't have time to chase down tonight, but the sages refer to this verse relative to this Torah portion And they read it, they say there's a possibility to read it a different way. Not that we all kind of read it and accept that, well, Adam and Eve were naked in the garden. It was no big deal. That was the way we were created to be. We were created to be naked. And it's only after sin that we needed clothes because of the insertion of his making the garment of skins for them after sin. But their question is, if they were naked, does that mean that they were always naked, or that they became naked in a situation where they should have been more modest? And is this what attracted the attention of the snake? That they were naked in a situation where they should have been covered. That's just one of those, for what it's worth, thrown in there to make us think about shame and having a consciousness of what nobility and honor Elohim created us to have. So the gift of Tamar is her ability to salvage Judah's honor, even when he has just very hypocritically sentenced her to burning. And so rather than produce these three things to a trumpet blast and say, aha, I caught you, and I'm going to tell everyone what you did. Everyone's going to recognize these things if I tell them what they are. She doesn't do that. She waits till the last moment when they're taking her out. At her own trial, apparently, she doesn't speak up. She waits until the last moment, giving him every opportunity to choose his type of shame and honor. Does he want number one, or does he want number two? Does he want illusory honor, or does he want the God type of honor? The nobility that is intrinsic inside of him because of how he was created different from an animal. And so she's sacrificing. She is on the road to Timna for sure. She is on that copper altar. She sacrifices her own honor so that he will open his eyes honorably. An eye is ayin in Hebrew. It can also mean a spring or a well. And there is a well in that picture I showed you. The water table has dropped, so it's not running right now. But in ancient times, it just gushed. So there is that well at biblical Tamar on the road to Timna, but there's another spring nearby, a day's walk if you had a flock of sheep, and it's literally named Ain Tamar. If you went by car, it'd be 20 miles. If you were on foot and went through the wadi, it would only be around 10 miles away. And so again, was this the actual site of their meeting? That's not probable. But is it the site, or is it the Torah location with spiritual meaning? I think so. And Rabbi Kook comments about Tamar's honor for Judah. We tend to wait to treat people honorably until they treat us honorably, or until they do something that's honorable or valuable to us. But in Tamar's case, she is treated disrespectfully and dishonorably at every turn. And nevertheless, she, up till the last moment, honors Judah and gives him an opportunity to do the honorable thing. Now, I don't think I could wait that long, which I'm not sure that would be my plan anyway. But that's a lesson for us, is there's a dishonorable world out there who they've chosen the wrong kind of honor. But if they see the reverence for Adonai in our lives, it's going to be because it shows up in giving honor to other people. Sometimes when they didn't earn it, sometimes they don't deserve it, but they're going to recognize it when we are able to sacrifice something in our lives, maybe even our own reputation, our own fame, our own wealth, whatever it might be that we value. But when we're willing to sacrifice that to salvage honor for an individual that we know is behaving despicably, that's a powerful message. We can confront people, we can navigate through disagreements with people and still have respect for that spark of Elohim that's inside every human being. And if we can respectfully disagree, then just our behavior will remind people that human beings are noble creatures. When they can't hear us, they can see us, hopefully. And when they see us behaving according to that gift of honor that the Holy One has put in us, it's a witness in itself. And this is, again, what Rav Kook wrote. He said, those with a noble and sensitive soul should feel that their own will to live is weakened if their own survival must come at the expense of another's disgrace and humiliation. For this reason, the sages did not write, one is required to throw oneself into a fiery furnace rather than shame a person publicly, but rather it is better to throw oneself into a fiery furnace. This is how one should feel, even if in practice it does not come to that. So the context of the saying, it's better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace than to shame a person publicly, he's pointing out how they phrased it. They don't say literally throw yourself into a furnace rather than shame someone. They say it's better to show you how you should feel about the situation. And so we're approaching another 10th of Tevet on December 25th. What would it say to the world if we fasted on that day? It might say that our eyes have opened to a crossroads of judgment. We recognize that the last 10th of Tevet, a judgment entered the world, possibly due because of so many dim eyes, so many livered hearts, so much dishonor for human beings. We want to honor his honor. And to do that, we need to open our eyes and begin making good decisions. In a book called Orot HaKodesh, it says, as the world advances in its superficial culture, it simultaneously declines in its inner worth. This deterioration is due to the phenomenon that with the advance of society's external values, the eye is increasingly captivated by superficialities and learns to belittle inner awareness. Due to this process, humanity's true worth continually dwindles. The world's redemption is dependent upon the revival of our inner perceptions. In other words, it's not doing yoga. It's not doing Eastern chants. There's so many things now that people are turning to. They know they're trying to turn on that inner eye, but they don't know how. We know how. And it's our job to model it, to have a life of prayer, because a life of prayer is a life that forces you to examine what's going on inside of you. It is a matter of inner perception, because you have to compare yourself to his holy word every time you pray. And when you see that there are disparities between his word and your behavior, it gives you the opportunity to humble yourself and repent when there is a soul inside of you saying, no, you don't need to do that. You don't need to be ashamed of anything. We have a whole culture that runs on the premise that nobody should ever feel ashamed of anything unless you disagree with me politically. No, it's all confusion. It's complete confusion. And so we have to be the model of the inner eye, of the crossroads of decision, of understanding the commandments. And so for the sake of time, I wanted to stop it here. Your homework is in Matthew 18, 1 through 18. And what the homework will do is allow you to take the next step that I would have taken you had we had another class to do it in. But if you'll look through Matthew 18, 1 through 18, I want you to go back and review what Rav Kook said about this, throwing yourself into a fiery furnace rather than shame a person publicly. And then his commentary of why it was written, it is better. It's not a commandment to throw yourself into a fiery furnace. I want you to compare that to what Yeshua is teaching his disciples in Matthew 18, 6 through 9, and see if you think those are similar paradigms. And then there's some expansion there. You can carry it out in the same context. I'm asking you to look for a passage that stands out as if it's designed to teach you about preventing humiliation to a brother. And then it gives you steps when you have a grievance, when a person is caught up in a sin. If a person's caught up in a sin, how do you confront that person? That's in number 3. Number 4, I want you to identify an animal that shows up in the Torah portion and in Yeshua's passage there. I want you to think about the judges and see how Tamar's traditional 3 judges were Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. I want you to see if you find any similarity to that in what Yeshua is saying. And then I want you to apply the 3 witnesses to Tamar. And here, you may not be interested in going back a week, but if you're interested in going back to Vayeshev, the same passage, Matthew 18, 18 through 19. It has here, what did you learn about legal agreements in that Torah portion that Yeshua is teaching in those 2 verses? And then there's some hints there. So, I felt like I was talking 90 miles an hour.